The island of Peleliu lay at the southern end of the Palau Group in the western Pacific, measuring approximately 6 miles in length and 2 miles in width, with a low coral shoreline enclosing an interior of ridges, broken limestone, and dense vegetation. The terrain consisted of a narrow coastal plain along the western shore, an airfield complex running roughly north to south, and a mass of jagged coral hills dominating the northern and central interior. The island's climate during the late summer months was characterized by sustained heat, high humidity, minimal cloud cover, and limited rainfall. Fresh water sources were scarce and largely controlled through artificial means. By early September 1944, Peleliu was occupied by elements of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy under the command of Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. Defensive preparations had been underway for several months. The Japanese garrison consisted of approximately 10,900 personnel, including infantry units, artillery detachments, naval base forces, construction units, and service troops. Defensive doctrine on the island emphasized depth, concealment, and fixed positions integrated into the terrain. Extensive tunnel networks were constructed within the limestone ridges, connecting firing positions, command posts, ammunition stores, and shelters. Many positions were hardened against bombardment and designed to provide interlocking fields of fire. The western coastal plain contained the primary landing beaches, designated by the attacking force as White and Orange Beaches. Inland from the beaches lay the airfield, which was approximately 3,500 feet in length and consisted of crushed coral runways and dispersal areas. North of the airfield rose a series of coral ridges, later identified on maps as the Ymerbergal Pocket, containing steep slopes, narrow draws, caves, and elevated firing points. These ridges overlooked the airfield and the approaches from the south and west. United States planning for the assault on Peleliu was conducted under the command of the 3 Amphibious Corps, led by Major General Roy S. Geiger. The principal assault force was the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General William H. Rupertus. Supporting elements included naval gunfire units, carrier-based air support, and later, elements of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division. The operational plan called for an amphibious landing on the western beaches, seizure of the airfield, and subsequent advance into the northern ridges to eliminate remaining resistance. Naval forces assigned to the operation included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and amphibious shipping. Pre-assault bombardment commenced several days prior to the landing. Naval gunfire targeted known and suspected defensive positions, coastal guns, and the airfield area. Carrier aircraft conducted strikes against installations, supply dumps, and defensive works. Bombardment schedules were executed according to pre-arranged plans, with adjustments based on aerial observation and spotter reports. Despite the volume of fire delivered, many Japanese defensive positions remained intact due to their construction within the coral and the depth of underground facilities. Camouflage and concealment reduced the effectiveness of aerial observation. The absence of significant visible movement contributed to assessments that resistance might be limited. On the morning of September 15, 1944, amphibious assault units began movement toward the island. Sea conditions were moderate, with a steady swell affecting landing craft. At approximately 0830 hours, naval gunfire intensified along the beaches and inland targets. Smoke screens were deployed in certain sectors. At each hour, the first waves of landing craft approached the reef line offshore. The reef surrounding Peleliu extended several hundred yards from the shoreline. Amphibious tractors were employed to carry assault troops across the reef and onto the beaches. As landing craft crossed the reef and closed on the shoreline, Japanese defensive fire increased in intensity. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, and small arms engaged the approaching waves. Several amphibious vehicles were struck and disabled. Casualties occurred before reaching the shore. Upon landing, assault units encountered immediate resistance from concealed positions along the beach and from elevated positions inland. The beach area was narrow, with limited cover. Japanese fire from the flanks and from inland positions crossed the landing zones. Engineering units began clearing obstacles and establishing exits from the beaches under fire. Casualties accumulated among infantry, engineers, and supporting personnel. Marine regiments advanced inland toward the airfield according to plan. Movement was conducted in small unit formations due to the intensity of fire and the nature of the terrain. Progress across the airfield was met with fire from dug-in positions along its edges and from the ridges beyond. The crushed coral surface reflected heat and limited traction. Aircraft wreckage, revetments, and debris provided intermittent cover. By midday, portions of the airfield were occupied by assault units. Japanese counterfire continued from the northern ridges and from positions concealed within the airfield perimeter. Artillery units established firing positions to support the advance. Forward observers coordinated naval gunfire and airstrikes against identified targets. Communications were affected by equipment losses and terrain interference. In the southern sector, units advanced toward the southern tip of the island, encountering resistance from fortified positions and occasional counterattacks. These actions involved close-range engagements with grenades, automatic weapons, and flamethrowers. Japanese personnel utilized concealed routes to move between positions and to engage advancing units from unexpected directions. The heat during daylight hours imposed additional strain. Personnel carried limited water supplies, and resupply was delayed by ongoing combat and congestion on the beaches. Medical evacuation was conducted under fire, with corpsmen treating casualties in exposed positions. Aid stations were established as terrain permitted. During the first night, Japanese forces conducted infiltration attempts against forward positions. Small groups moved through gaps in the lines, engaging rear-area personnel and supply points. Defensive fires were employed to contain these movements. Units remained in position with limited rest. On September 16, operations continued with renewed efforts to secure the airfield and advance into the northern ridges. Assault units encountered increasing resistance as they approached the Coral Hills. The terrain restricted the use of armored vehicles, and tanks were vulnerable to close-range attacks. Japanese anti-tank tactics included the use of mines, satchel charges, and close assault methods. The northern ridges consisted of multiple parallel spurs and draws. Each ridge contained interconnected caves and firing positions. Assaulting units employed infantry tactics adapted to the terrain, including the use of flamethrowers, demolitions, and coordinated small unit maneuvers. Progress was measured in yards. Positions cleared during daylight were sometimes reoccupied by Japanese personnel moving through the tunnel systems. Artillery and naval gunfire continued to support ground operations. Fire missions were adjusted to avoid friendly positions, with spotters positioned as close to the front as conditions allowed. Air support was limited by proximity of friendly forces and the difficulty of identifying targets within the terrain. By the end of the second day, the airfield was largely under U.S. control, though fire continued from surrounding high ground. Casualties among assault units had increased steadily. Replacement personnel and additional supplies were brought ashore as beach operations continued under intermittent fire. On September 17, attention shifted increasingly toward the Ymerbergal ridges. Assault units entered narrow draws under fire from elevated positions. The coral terrain caused fragmentation patterns from artillery and grenades to behave unpredictably. Smoke was used to obscure movement, though wind conditions affected its persistence. Japanese defensive fire was disciplined and controlled. Positions were revealed primarily when they engaged advancing troops. Attempts to suppress these positions required direct engagement at close range. The use of flamethrowers and demolition charges became standard practice in clearing caves and bunkers. Each position required individual attention, with supporting fires coordinated to prevent enfilade. Night operations were limited due to terrain and the risk of disorientation. Defensive perimeters were established around gained ground. Japanese infiltration continued, with small-scale engagements occurring throughout the night. Trip flares, listening posts, and coordinated defensive fires were employed. Supply difficulties increased as operations moved inland. Water shortages were acute. Evacuation of wounded required movement over exposed ground. Heat-related casualties were reported alongside combat injuries. Command posts were established in sheltered areas when available. Communications relied on field telephones, radios, and runners. Equipment losses and terrain interference affected reliability. Situation reports were compiled as conditions allowed and transmitted to higher headquarters. By September 18, the pattern of operations was established. Advances into the ridges proceeded incrementally, with heavy resistance at each position. Japanese forces remained largely within their prepared defenses, engaging selectively. U.S. units adapted their tactics to the conditions encountered, emphasizing coordination between infantry, engineers, artillery, and supporting fires. Naval and air support continued on scheduled and on-call bases. Bombardment focused on ridge lines and suspected tunnel entrances. Observers adjusted fire based on visible effects and reported enemy activity. The terrain limited observation and assessment of damage. As operations continued, additional units prepared to reinforce the assault force. Planning for subsequent phases was conducted concurrently with ongoing combat. Medical facilities expanded ashore to handle the volume of casualties. Supply dumps were established under cover where possible. The combat environment on Peleliu during these initial days was defined by close-range engagements, limited maneuver space, and sustained resistance from concealed positions. Operations proceeded according to orders issued in response to conditions encountered, with adjustments made as information became available. The sequence of actions followed the immediate requirements of securing terrain, maintaining supply lines, and responding to enemy activity as it occurred. By September 19, 1944, ground operations on Peleliu continued under the same environmental conditions present since the initial landing. Daytime temperatures remained high, and the coral terrain reflected heat upward, affecting personnel engaged in prolonged movement and combat. Water distribution remained constrained by beach congestion, enemy fire, and limited transport inland. Units already committed to the northern ridges maintained forward positions established during the preceding days. The primary focus of operations shifted further into the Ymerbergal Ridge complex. The terrain consisted of irregular coral formations rising sharply from narrow valleys. Ridges varied in height and were intersected by ravines that limited lateral movement. Vegetation was sparse on exposed rock but denser in lower areas, where scrub and small trees provided concealment. Japanese defensive positions were integrated into the natural rock, with firing apertures positioned to cover approaches along draws and ridge lines. Assault units advanced in small elements, often squads or fire teams, due to restricted visibility and limited maneuver space. Movement typically involved climbing, crawling, or descending steep slopes under intermittent fire. Japanese defenders engaged primarily from concealed positions at close range. Fire was directed at advancing troops once they entered pre-registered engagement areas. The use of grenades, small arms, and automatic weapons predominated in these encounters. Efforts to neutralize individual positions followed established procedures. Infantry elements identified firing points through observation of muzzle flashes, sound, or movement. Supporting weapons were brought forward where terrain permitted. Flamethrower operators and demolition teams moved under cover of suppressive fire. Charges were placed at cave entrances or firing apertures, followed by withdrawal and detonation. In many cases, additional fire was required after initial clearing, as Japanese personnel used alternate exits within tunnel systems. Artillery support continued throughout the day. Batteries positioned on the coastal plain and near the airfield delivered fire missions against ridge lines and suspected concentrations. Forward observers operated from exposed positions, often under fire, to adjust impacts. Naval gunfire was used selectively due to proximity of friendly forces. Air support sorties were conducted when weather and coordination allowed, with aircraft delivering ordnance against designated targets on the ridges. During daylight hours, evacuation of wounded remained difficult. Stretcher teams moved casualties along narrow paths exposed to fire and heat. Aid stations were established in defolated areas when possible, though available shelter was limited. Medical personnel treated combat wounds, dehydration, and heat exhaustion. Supplies of plasma, bandages, and morphine were expended steadily. Japanese activity during the night of 19 to 20 September included continued infiltration attempts. Small groups moved through terrain features and tunnel exits to approach U.S. positions. Engagements occurred at close range, often involving hand grenades and small arms. Defensive fires were employed to disrupt movement. Units maintained listening posts and perimeter security throughout the night. On September 20, operations resumed with renewed attempts to gain control of key ridge features. Specific hills and spurs were designated as objectives based on their tactical position relative to supply routes and observation points. Progress remained slow. Each advance required coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting fires. Tanks were employed where access routes permitted, though their movement was restricted by terrain and vulnerability to close-range attack. Japanese anti-armor measures included concealed positions overlooking narrow approaches. Tanks advancing without infantry support were subject to attack by individuals employing explosives at close range. As a result, armored movement was typically coordinated closely with infantry, with dismounted troops clearing adjacent terrain. Communications difficulties persisted. Radios were affected by terrain masking, equipment damage, and battery depletion. Field telephones were extended forward where possible, though lines were frequently cut by artillery fire or movement. Runners were used extensively to transmit messages between units and command posts. Logistical operations continued under fire. Supply parties moved ammunition, water, rations, and medical supplies forward from beach dumps and airfield depots. Routes were exposed and congested. Japanese fire intermittently targeted known or suspected supply paths. Engineering units worked to improve routes by clearing debris and marking paths. By September 21, elements of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division began landing on Peleliu and nearby Angar Island. Coordination between Marine and Army units was conducted at higher command levels. Army units were assigned sectors and prepared to relieve Marine units in certain areas as operations progressed. Combat in the Ymerbergal area continued without significant change in pattern. Japanese defenders remained largely within prepared positions, engaging selectively. Tunnel networks allowed movement between positions without exposure. Attempts to seal tunnel systems were limited by the extent of the underground works and the availability of demolition materials. During this period, casualty rates among assault units remained steady. Replacement personnel were integrated into units as available. The process involved brief orientation and assignment to existing squads or teams. Replacement personnel were exposed to combat conditions immediately upon arrival at forward positions. Weather conditions remained consistent, with minimal cloud cover and little rainfall. Dust from the coral terrain was pervasive, affecting visibility and equipment. Weapons required frequent maintenance to prevent malfunctions. Water purification units operated near the airfield, though output was limited. On September 22, operations focused on reducing resistance along specific ridge segments that overlooked supply routes and assembly areas. Assault units advanced under covering fire, employing smoke to obscure movement. Japanese positions were engaged sequentially. Gains were measured in limited distances, often requiring repeated assaults on the same ground. Naval gunfire support was requested for targets beyond immediate infantry range. Spotters coordinated fire from offshore vessels. The effects of naval bombardment were observed where terrain allowed, though many positions remained concealed within rock formations. Air support included fighter bombers delivering ordnance against designated targets. Pilots relied on smoke markers and radio communication to identify target areas. The proximity of friendly forces required precise coordination. Sorties were limited by fuel and ammunition considerations. Nightfall brought renewed infiltration attempts. Japanese personnel utilized darkness and terrain familiarity to approach U.S. lines. Defensive measures included coordinated fires, illumination rounds, and prearranged artillery concentrations. Engagements were localized but frequent. By September 23, fatigue among forward units was evident. Continuous operations, limited rest, and environmental conditions affected personnel. Commanders rotated units where possible, though terrain and ongoing combat limited large-scale relief. Units held positions gained, consolidating defensive perimeters. Medical evacuation capacity was expanded as additional facilities were established near the airfield. Casualties were transported by litter, vehicle, and amphibious craft as conditions allowed. Naval medical units received wounded evacuated from the island. Japanese artillery and mortar fire continued intermittently. Fire missions targeted assembly areas, supply routes, and known positions. Counter-battery efforts were limited by difficulty in locating concealed enemy guns. The pattern of combat remained consistent through September 24. Assaults into the ridges proceeded incrementally. Each engagement involved identification of enemy positions, application of suppressive fire, and close assault. Tunnel systems continued to allow Japanese defenders to reappear in previously cleared areas. Coordination between Marine and Army units increased as relief operations were planned. Army units prepared to assume responsibility for certain sectors, allowing Marine units to withdraw for rest or reassignment. These movements were conducted under fire and required careful coordination. By the end of this phase, operations on Peleliu were characterized by sustained close combat within the ridge complex, ongoing logistical challenges, and continued resistance from prepared defensive positions. Actions were conducted according to immediate operational requirements, with adjustments made based on conditions encountered and information available at the time. By September 25, 1944, responsibility for portions of the northern sector on Peleliu began to transition as planned. Elements of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division moved into designated areas to relieve Marine units that had been engaged continuously since the initial landings. These reliefs were conducted under ongoing combat conditions. Units moved along narrow, exposed routes while maintaining security. Positions were transferred with limited opportunity for detailed handover beyond immediate terrain orientation and known enemy locations. Marine units withdrawing from forward positions moved toward assembly areas near the airfield or coastal zones. Many personnel were reassigned to reserve roles or prepared for redeployment. Equipment was inspected and redistributed as available. Casualty returns and personnel strength reports were updated as conditions permitted. Army units assuming responsibility for ridge sectors encountered the same terrain and defensive conditions previously faced by Marine forces. The Ymerbergal Ridge complex remained occupied by Japanese defenders utilizing caves, tunnels, and reinforced positions. Army infantry units adapted to the established pattern of operations, employing small unit tactics, engineers, flamethrowers, and demolitions in coordination with artillery support. On September 26, Army units initiated assaults against assigned ridge objectives. Movement into the coral formations required climbing and close coordination. Japanese defensive fire was encountered from concealed positions at short range. Engagements followed established procedures, with suppressive fire used to allow assault elements to approach firing apertures and cave entrances. Artillery units supporting Army operations adjusted firing data based on new observation posts. Fire missions targeted ridge crests, draws, and suspected tunnel entrances. Forward observers operated under fire, often relocating to maintain visibility. Naval gunfire remained available for targets beyond immediate infantry range. Logistical operations continued under constraints. Supply routes from beach and airfield dumps to forward positions were exposed and required continuous movement. Ammunition expenditure remained high due to the nature of close combat. Water shortages persisted, with distribution prioritized to forward units. Engineering personnel worked to improve paths and clear debris where possible. Japanese activity during nighttime hours remained consistent. Infiltration attempts targeted forward positions and rear areas. Small groups moved through tunnel exits and natural cover. Defensive measures included perimeter security, prearranged fires, and illumination. Engagements occurred at close range, often without warning. By September 27, Army units had established forward positions within portions of the ridge complex. Progress remained incremental. Each cleared position required continued observation and security to prevent reoccupation. Japanese defenders continued to utilize underground routes to move between positions, complicating efforts to secure cleared ground. Medical operations adjusted to the changing unit composition. Army medical personnel established aid stations closer to forward areas as terrain permitted. Casualties were evacuated along established routes to rear facilities. Treatment addressed combat wounds, dehydration, and heat-related conditions. Weather conditions remained unchanged. Heat and humidity affected personnel endurance. Dust from the coral terrain continued to affect visibility and equipment. Weapons maintenance remained a constant requirement to prevent malfunctions. On September 28, coordinated assaults were conducted against specific ridge features identified as sources of sustained fire. Infantry units advanced under covering fire from artillery and mortars. Flamethrowers were employed against cave entrances, followed by demolition charges. In several cases, secondary explosions indicated stored ammunition within cave systems. Japanese defensive fire decreased temporarily following heavy bombardment but resumed as assault units approached. Engagements continued at close range. Progress was measured in limited distances, often requiring repeated attempts to clear the same positions. Communications difficulties persisted. Radios were affected by terrain and equipment wear. Field telephone lines were extended forward but frequently cut. Runners remained essential for transmitting orders and reports. Command posts were relocated as necessary to maintain control. By September 29, additional Army units were committed to the northern sector. Coordination between units focused on maintaining continuous pressure on defensive positions while securing supply routes. Artillery fire plans were adjusted to support simultaneous assaults along multiple ridge lines. Japanese artillery and mortar fire continued intermittently. Fire missions targeted assembly areas and known supply routes. Counter-battery efforts were limited by the difficulty of locating concealed firing positions within the terrain. Night operations remained defensive in nature. Units consolidated gained ground and established security measures. Japanese infiltration attempts continued, though frequency varied by sector. Defensive fires were employed to disrupt movement. On September 30, operations continued along the same pattern. Assaults focused on isolating and reducing individual ridge positions. Tunnel entrances were identified and targeted when possible. Efforts to seal tunnel systems were constrained by their extent and complexity. Casualty rates remained steady. Replacement personnel continued to arrive and were integrated into units as available. Orientation was brief due to ongoing combat requirements. Units adjusted formations and assignments based on personnel strength. Supply operations adapted to evolving front lines. New supply routes were established as terrain was secured. Engineering units marked paths and cleared obstacles. Beach operations continued to support the flow of material. By October 1, Army units had assumed primary responsibility for the Ymerburgal area. Marine units remaining on the island were assigned to reserve or support roles. Coordination between Army units focused on maintaining pressure on remaining defensive positions while securing rear areas. Combat conditions remained unchanged. Japanese defenders continued to operate from prepared positions, engaging selectively. Tunnel networks allowed movement without exposure. Each position required direct engagement to neutralize. Medical evacuation continued through established channels. Naval medical units received evacuated casualties. Treatment and transport were conducted as conditions allowed. On October 2, artillery and mortar support intensified against identified ridge positions. Infantry units advanced following bombardment. Engagements continued at close range. Gains were limited and required consolidation. By October 3, the pattern of operations persisted. Incremental advances, close-range engagements, and sustained logistical effort defined daily activities. Actions were conducted in response to immediate tactical requirements, with adjustments based on observed enemy activity and terrain constraints. By October 4, 1944, units of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division maintained the forward line in the Ymerburgal Ridge complex while rear areas on the coastal plain and around the airfield continued to support supply, evacuation, and command functions. The airfield remained in use for liaison aircraft as conditions permitted, with traffic control to avoid exposing ground personnel to intermittent mortar and artillery fire. Beach dumps along the western shore continued to receive cargo from amphibious shipping. Unloading operations were timed and dispersed where possible, with personnel assigned to move supplies inland in small loads to reduce losses from observed fire. Forward movement into the ridges continued in short advances. Each day began with limited reconnaissance by patrols and observation from available high points. Japanese positions were rarely visible in daylight except when firing. Reports from patrols described narrow draws under flanking fire, cave mouths screened by rock outcrops, and firing slits difficult to detect against coral surfaces. Infantry platoons were assigned objectives that could be reached in minutes by distance but required hours by route due to elevation changes and exposure. Artillery preparation was conducted on request and according to scheduled plans. Batteries located near the airfield delivered concentrations on ridge crests, suspected cave entrances, and reverse slopes where defenders were believed to be sheltered. Mortar sections fired from positions where they could angle rounds into draws and depressions. Forward observers adjusted fire by sound and limited view, using smoke markers when air support was available. Naval gunfire was used less frequently as target areas lay near forward troops and observation from offshore was restricted by terrain. On October 5, a series of small assaults were initiated against positions that had generated repeated machine gun fire into a supply route running along a shallow valley. Infantry advanced in short rushes, using cover behind coral projections. Engineers moved with assault elements carrying satchel charges and demolition materials. A flamethrower team was brought forward after suppressive fire was established. The operator approached within effective range and directed flame into a cave opening at the base of a ridge. Demolition charges were then placed near the entrance. After detonation, the entrance was partially blocked, but firing resumed later from an adjacent aperture on the same face, indicating connected interior spaces or alternate exits. Casualty evacuation continued along the same routes. Litter teams moved wounded men down slopes under intermittent fire, pausing behind cover when rounds struck nearby rock. At the base of the ridges, casualties were transferred to vehicles when roads allowed, then moved to aid stations and rear medical facilities. Medical personnel recorded treatment and evacuation details as circumstances permitted. Supplies of plasma, sulfa drugs, and bandages were replenished from beach depots, with distribution prioritized to forward aid stations. Night conditions remained active. Japanese personnel continued to move from concealed exits to conduct infiltration and harassment. Small groups approached forward foxholes and attempted grenade attacks. Defensive measures included listening posts placed forward of the main line, trip flares positioned along likely approaches, and prearranged mortar and artillery fires. When infiltration was detected, units fired flares and illuminated the area with small arms and machine guns. Engagements often ended without confirmation of enemy casualties due to darkness and the ability of the defenders to withdraw into the terrain. On October 6, a renewed effort was made to secure a ridge spur that provided observation over a portion of the airfield perimeter. Infantry climbed along a narrow path exposed to fire from above. Supporting mortars fired smoke to screen movement. As troops reached a small saddle, they encountered grenade and small arms fire from a concealed position on the reverse slope. The assault element withdrew a short distance, and supporting fire was called in. After the fire mission, a second advance was made. Engineers placed a charge at a suspected entrance, detonated it, and then infantry moved forward to occupy the crest. Later in the day, fire resumed from nearby positions, requiring continued clearing operations along the ridge line. Communications between forward companies and battalion command posts remained inconsistent. Radio messages were affected by terrain masking and equipment wear. Field telephone lines were extended where possible but were often cut by shell fragments or movement over sharp coral edges. Runners were employed repeatedly, moving along exposed paths with written messages. Delays in message delivery affected the timing of supporting fires and resupply. By October 7, ammunition expenditure in forward areas remained high. Units requested additional grenades, demolition charges, and small arms ammunition. Water resupply continued to be a limiting factor. Water containers carried forward were frequently punctured by fragments or damaged during movement across rock. Personnel were instructed to conserve water, with distribution controlled by unit leadership. Heat-related cases continued to be reported, particularly among men carrying heavy loads up steep terrain. Air support missions occurred when coordination allowed. Fighter bombers approached target areas marked by smoke or by prearranged reference points. Ordnance was delivered against designated ridge segments. After strikes, infantry observed dust and debris rising from impact zones, but continued to receive fire from positions that were not visibly damaged. The difficulty of assessing effects in the coral formations remained constant. On October 8, Army units conducted coordinated operations with adjacent elements to reduce a cluster of positions along a draw used by Japanese defenders to move between ridge compartments. Patrols attempted to locate exits and entry points by observing movement at dawn and dusk. When a likely exit was identified, the area was targeted with mortars. Infantry then advanced to the position and employed grenades and small demolition charges. The draw remained under intermittent fire after the action, suggesting additional openings beyond those reached. Rear areas continued to be subjected to sporadic mortar fire. Supply dumps were dispersed where possible, and ammunition was stored in separated stacks. Personnel were instructed to take cover during incoming rounds. Engineers dug additional slit trenches and improved existing shelters. Construction units repaired damaged roads and improved drainage where limited rainfall created temporary pools. On October 9, the tempo of assaults continued. A battalion-level plan called for simultaneous pressure along multiple ridge faces to prevent defenders from shifting fire and personnel. Assault elements moved forward at first light, supported by mortars and machine guns firing from lower ground. Progress was limited by overlapping fields of fire from concealed apertures. When an assault element attempted to flank a position by climbing an adjacent spur, it encountered additional fire from a different elevation, indicating interlocking coverage. After several hours, limited ground was gained, and units consolidated in shallow foxholes chipped into coral. Throughout this period, Japanese defenders continued to operate with controlled fire discipline. They engaged at short range and ceased fire when targets moved out of pre-selected areas. At times, firing resumed from positions that had been previously engaged by flamethrowers and demolitions, indicating either incomplete neutralization or replacement of defenders through tunnel routes. Patrols reported hearing movement inside rock formations, including voices and metallic sounds, though direct observation remained rare. On October 10, additional artillery ammunition was delivered to batteries supporting the ridge operations. Fire missions continued throughout the day. Some rounds struck coral faces and produced showers of fragments that affected nearby troops. Units adjusted positions to reduce exposure, but cover options remained limited. When possible, troops used natural crevices, shallow caves, and reverse slopes for shelter. Medical facilities near the airfield continued to operate under load. Surgical teams worked continuously during peak casualty inflows. Records of admissions, treatments, and outcomes were maintained as part of operational reporting. Blood plasma supplies were monitored closely. Evacuation by ship continued when sea conditions and enemy activity allowed, with casualties transferred from shore to landing craft and then to offshore medical vessels. On October 11, operations included attempts to seal a series of connected caves along a ridge face. Engineers and infantry worked together, placing charges at multiple openings in sequence. Smoke and dust made it difficult to determine whether all entrances were blocked. After detonations, infantry placed guards at accessible openings to prevent immediate reoccupation. During the night, firing resumed from a different point on the same ridge, suggesting that the tunnel system remained functional beyond the blocked sections. Night engagements continued to involve infiltration and close-range grenade attacks. Units reported Japanese personnel approaching within a few yards of foxholes. Defensive responses included immediate small arms fire, grenades thrown toward suspected movement, and calls for mortar illumination. Some infiltrators were found dead near defensive positions at first light, while others were not located. On October 12, the forward line remained largely in the same general position, with small adjustments based on local gains and losses. Commanders focused on maintaining continuous security of cleared areas and on sustaining supplies to forward units. Rations were distributed with limited variety, primarily canned goods and dry items. Cooking was rare in forward areas due to exposure and the need for concealment. The airfield perimeter remained under observation from ridge positions. Occasional rounds struck near aircraft parking areas. Ground crews minimized time in open areas during daylight. Maintenance and refueling were conducted rapidly, and aircraft movement was planned to reduce exposure. On October 13, a coordinated assault targeted a ridge point that had repeatedly fired into a route used by litter teams. Mortar fire was used to suppress the ridge face while infantry advanced along a lower approach. A flamethrower team attempted to reach a cave entrance but was engaged by fire from an aperture above the opening. Supporting fire was redirected to that aperture. The flamethrower operator then advanced and delivered flame into the entrance. Engineers followed with a charge. After detonation, the entrance collapsed partially. Litter teams later moved along the route with reduced fire for several hours, though intermittent rounds resumed by evening. By October 14, the operational pattern remained unchanged. The ridge complex required continued direct engagement of individual positions. Infantry units rotated small elements to maintain pressure while allowing brief rest for others. Relief in place occurred at night or during periods of reduced firing. Movement during relief was controlled and conducted quietly to reduce detection. On October 15, rain fell briefly in scattered areas, reducing dust but increasing humidity. The ground in lower areas became slick, affecting movement. Water collection was attempted using ponchos and containers, though amounts were limited. The rain did not end water shortages, and distribution continued to rely on delivered supplies. Japanese mortar fire increased during periods when U.S. troops concentrated in assembly areas for assaults. Observers attempted to identify firing points by sound and flash, but the terrain reduced accuracy. Countermortar fire was employed when likely locations were plotted. Results were difficult to confirm. On October 16, Army units extended their positions along a ridge line to connect with adjacent elements and reduce gaps. The movement required climbing under intermittent fire. Engineers cleared small paths and marked routes with tape and signs where possible. Communication between adjacent units improved through direct liaison, though terrain continued to separate positions. During the same period, operations on nearby islands in the Palau Group continued, and reports and messages moved through command channels. On Peleliu, the primary daily focus remained the ridge complex, the maintenance of supply, and the evacuation of casualties. On October 17, a series of patrols entered a draw at first light to search for additional tunnel exits. One patrol encountered fire from a concealed position and withdrew. Mortar fire was placed into the draw, followed by a second patrol attempt. The patrol located a small opening partially concealed by vegetation. A grenade was thrown into the opening, followed by small arms fire directed at the entrance. No movement was observed afterward, but the opening was not fully sealed due to limited demolition material at that moment. On October 18, assault elements attempted to clear a narrow ridge crest where defenders had placed firing apertures on both sides. Infantry advanced in single file along the crest due to the narrow path. Fire from the flanks forced men to take cover behind low coral projections. Grenades were used repeatedly. A flamethrower was not brought to that crest due to difficulty of movement and exposure. Instead, demolition charges were placed by hand at close range, with men withdrawing along the same narrow route. After the blasts, infantry moved forward and occupied part of the crest, then established foxholes in shallow rock depressions. By October 19, the line had shifted only slightly. Casualties continued to accumulate. Unit records and situation reports noted strength reductions and ammunition consumption. Replacement personnel continued to arrive and were assigned to units. Orientation consisted of brief instruction on terrain, enemy tactics, and immediate responsibilities. Medical units recorded continued cases of heat exhaustion and dehydration, though cooler nights offered limited relief. Wounds from fragments and small arms remained common. Burn injuries occurred among flamethrower operators and personnel near demolitions and incendiary effects. On October 20, artillery support included increased use of airburst and time-fused rounds where available, intended to shower fragments into exposed positions and cave mouths. Observers attempted to time fires to coincide with infantry movement. Coordination required reliable communication, which remained difficult. When fires fell short or near friendly positions, units adjusted and halted movement until corrected. Japanese defenders continued to conserve ammunition and engage selectively. At times, they allowed troops to move into exposed areas before opening fire. When assaulted directly, they frequently withdrew into tunnels, then reappeared at nearby openings. This pattern required continuous security and repeated clearing efforts. On October 21, a localized Japanese counterattack occurred against a forward position at night. A small group approached under darkness and engaged with grenades and small arms. The defending unit responded with automatic fire and grenades. Mortar illumination was fired, revealing movement briefly. After several minutes, the attackers withdrew. At first light, bodies and equipment were found near the perimeter. The position remained occupied, and defensive measures were reinforced. On October 22, engineers continued efforts to improve the main supply route from the airfield to the ridge base. Coral was leveled in places, and damaged sections were repaired. Vehicles could reach closer to the ridge foot in some sectors, reducing the distance litter teams and supply parties needed to carry loads by hand. Nevertheless, the final ascent to forward positions remained on foot. On October 23, a series of coordinated assaults were conducted using combined infantry, engineers, and supporting weapons. Mortars fired smoke to screen movement, and machine guns fired from prepared positions to suppress known apertures. Flamethrower operators advanced to several entrances and delivered flame, followed by demolition charges. In some instances, secondary explosions occurred. After assaults, infantry occupied the cleared ground and placed guards at openings. Night infiltration continued, and some positions required renewed clearing. On October 24, supply stocks of demolition charges and flamethrower fuel were monitored closely. Distribution was prioritized to units conducting assaults. Ammunition for small arms and mortars continued to move forward daily. Food and water remained critical. Units reported that water distribution could not always meet consumption demands under heat and exertion. On October 25, combat continued with limited gains. Patrols reported that some ridge compartments remained interconnected, allowing defenders to shift between sectors. Attempts to isolate compartments by sealing known openings were partial. The number of openings and the complexity of tunnels prevented complete closure with available resources. By October 26, the forward line remained contested across multiple ridge points. Commanders adjusted tactics by increasing the use of night patrols to locate movement and by establishing more robust listening posts. Some patrols entered shallow caves to assess their depth, withdrawing when confronted by interior fire or when the risk of entrapment increased. On October 27, artillery and mortar support continued. Air support was employed when available. Infantry advanced in short assaults and held gained ground. Medical evacuation continued under fire. Rear areas remained active with resupply and repair operations. On October 28, a brief reduction in enemy fire was noted in one sector during daylight, followed by renewed firing after troops moved forward. This sequence led to increased caution during movement. Assault elements coordinated closely with supporting fire and advanced in smaller increments, pausing to observe and listen before exposing themselves on ridge crests or in draws. On October 29, engineering teams attempted to place larger charges to collapse sections of ridge face. The placement required close approach under fire. Some charges were detonated successfully, creating rockfalls that blocked openings. In other cases, the rockfalls created new crevices and did not fully close the interior spaces. After detonations, infantry observed for movement and engaged any visible activity. By October 30, the operational situation remained one of continued direct engagement with prepared defenses. Units remained in forward positions, rotated small elements where possible, and maintained supply and evacuation routes. The pattern of daily activity consisted of reconnaissance, supporting fires, short assaults, consolidation, night defense against infiltration, and repeated efforts to locate and neutralize concealed positions as they fired or were discovered. By October 31, 1944, operations on Peleliu continued within the same general framework established over the previous weeks. Forward elements of the 81st Infantry Division maintained pressure against remaining Japanese positions in the Ymerbergal Ridge complex. The terrain remained unchanged, with steep coral ridges, narrow draws, and interconnected caves dictating the conduct of operations. Daily activity followed a routine shaped by limited visibility, restricted movement, and close-range engagements. Morning actions typically began with patrols sent forward to test enemy reactions and identify active firing points. These patrols moved cautiously, often halting to listen for movement within rock formations. Japanese defenders continued to avoid prolonged exposure, firing briefly and withdrawing into tunnels. Patrol reports were compiled and used to plan artillery, mortar, and infantry actions for the day. Artillery support remained a constant feature. Batteries near the airfield and coastal areas fired missions throughout daylight hours. Fire was adjusted frequently as infantry advanced or halted. Mortar units provided close support, firing smoke, high explosive, and illumination rounds as required. Ammunition resupply to gun positions was conducted continuously, with vehicles moving along improved routes where available. On November 1, infantry units conducted a series of localized assaults against ridge points that had remained active sources of fire. These assaults followed established procedures. Suppressive fire was applied first, followed by movement of assault elements under cover. Flamethrowers were used when access allowed. Demolition charges were placed at entrances or firing apertures. After each action, infantry occupied the immediate area and established security. Japanese defenders continued to utilize tunnel systems to reappear at alternate points. In several instances, fire resumed from positions believed to have been neutralized earlier. This required repeated engagements and continuous observation. Guards were posted at accessible openings when manpower permitted, though the number of potential exits exceeded available personnel. Supply operations continued under strain. Water distribution remained a priority. Water points were established closer to the ridge base as routes improved, but forward positions still relied on manual carry. Food consisted primarily of packaged rations. Cooking was limited to rear areas due to exposure and the need for concealment. Medical operations continued without interruption. Aid stations near the airfield and along supply routes treated a steady flow of casualties. Surgical teams operated during peak periods. Evacuation to ships offshore continued as conditions allowed. Medical records were maintained in accordance with reporting requirements. Night activity remained consistent. Japanese infiltration attempts occurred irregularly, with small groups approaching U.S. lines under cover of darkness. Defensive measures included listening posts, trip flares, and prearranged fires. When contact was made, engagements were brief and localized. At first light, patrols checked areas near defensive positions for signs of enemy presence. On November 2, a coordinated effort focused on a ridge compartment identified as a transit route between several defensive positions. Mortar fire was used to suppress suspected exits. Infantry advanced to the compartment and engaged several small openings with grenades and small arms fire. Engineers attempted to seal 2 openings with charges. After the detonations, dust and smoke limited visibility. No immediate fire resumed from those points, though activity was later reported from an adjacent ridge face. Communications continued to rely on a combination of radios, field telephones, and runners. Terrain continued to interfere with radio transmission. Telephone lines were extended as positions shifted but were frequently damaged. Runners moved under fire along narrow routes, carrying written messages between units and command posts. On November 3, weather conditions remained stable, with clear skies and high temperatures. Heat continued to affect personnel endurance. Heat exhaustion cases were reported alongside combat casualties. Units adjusted work-rest cycles where possible, though combat requirements often limited rest. Air support missions were conducted when coordination allowed. Aircraft delivered ordnance against designated ridge segments. After strikes, infantry advanced to assess effects. In many cases, fire continued from positions not visibly affected by the bombardment. Air support remained a supplementary measure due to the difficulty of identifying targets within the terrain. Japanese mortar and artillery fire continued intermittently. Rounds landed near supply routes, assembly areas, and the airfield perimeter. Casualties and equipment damage occurred sporadically. Counter-battery efforts were conducted when firing points could be estimated, though confirmation of results remained limited. By November 4, remaining Japanese positions were increasingly isolated by the accumulation of cleared ground around them. However, isolation did not prevent continued resistance. Defenders continued to fire from caves and apertures overlooking approaches. Infantry units advanced cautiously, avoiding unnecessary exposure. On November 5, a series of small patrol actions resulted in the discovery of additional cave entrances concealed by vegetation and rock. Some entrances were engaged immediately with grenades and small arms. Others were marked for later demolition when materials became available. Engineers coordinated with infantry to prioritize targets based on observed activity. Rear area operations continued to support the forward effort. Engineering units maintained roads and paths, repaired damage from shelling, and improved drainage in low areas. Supply personnel managed beach and airfield dumps, dispersing stores to reduce vulnerability. Administrative personnel compiled daily reports on strength, casualties, and material status. On November 6, infantry units conducted limited advances into a narrow draw that had remained under intermittent fire. Mortars fired smoke to screen movement. Assault elements advanced in short rushes, taking cover behind coral projections. A small opening was located on the draw's side. A flamethrower was brought forward and employed. After flame application, engineers placed a charge. The opening collapsed partially. Fire from the draw decreased for the remainder of the day. Night operations continued with the same defensive posture. Listening posts reported occasional movement. Illumination rounds were fired intermittently. No large-scale attacks occurred during this period. On November 7, patrols reported reduced enemy fire in several sectors during daylight hours. Units advanced cautiously, expecting renewed resistance. In some areas, previously active positions remained silent. In others, brief fire resumed when troops moved into exposed areas. The pattern required continued vigilance. Medical units noted a slight reduction in casualty intake during daylight hours, though night engagements and accidents continued to produce injuries. Evacuation operations remained in place. By November 8, command assessments indicated that organized resistance was diminishing in some ridge compartments. However, isolated positions continued to fire sporadically. Units maintained pressure through patrols, targeted fires, and limited assaults. On November 9, engineers attempted to collapse a prominent cave system by placing charges at multiple entrances. Coordination required simultaneous placement. Charges were detonated in sequence. Rockfalls occurred, blocking several openings. Dust clouds reduced visibility for an extended period. Infantry guarded the area afterward. No immediate fire resumed from those points, though activity was later reported from a distant aperture. Supply operations adjusted as forward lines stabilized. Some routes previously under fire were used more frequently. Vehicle access improved in certain sectors, reducing manual carry distances. On November 10, a patrol encountered resistance from a concealed position thought to have been inactive. After a brief exchange, supporting fire was called in. The position was engaged with mortars. Infantry then advanced and placed grenades into the opening. No further fire was observed from that point during daylight. Night conditions remained tense but relatively quiet. Infiltration attempts were fewer in number but still occurred. Defensive measures remained in effect. By November 11, remaining Japanese resistance consisted primarily of isolated positions firing intermittently. Units continued to clear these positions as they were identified. Patrols reported fewer signs of coordinated movement within the tunnels, though individual defenders continued to engage. Medical and supply operations continued as before. Personnel strength reports reflected accumulated losses and replacements. Units adjusted internal organization to maintain effectiveness. On November 12, a series of patrols advanced into areas previously inaccessible due to fire. Several abandoned positions were found, containing equipment, ammunition, and personal effects. Some caves showed signs of recent occupancy, while others appeared unused for extended periods. Patrols withdrew after marking locations. Artillery support continued to be available but was used less frequently as targets became more sporadic. Mortar fire remained the primary means of immediate support when contact occurred. On November 13, infantry units conducted coordinated sweeps of designated sectors, moving methodically along ridge lines and through draws. Movement was slow and deliberate. When fire was encountered, units halted and applied suppressive measures before advancing. Gains were limited but cumulative. By November 14, the number of daily engagements had decreased. Units remained alert, as isolated defenders continued to fire when opportunities arose. Night security remained strict. On November 15, patrols reported minimal enemy activity in several sectors. Commanders directed continued patrols and observation to confirm conditions. Supply and evacuation routes remained open and functional. Medical units continued to treat residual casualties. Evacuation to ships offshore continued as needed. Records were maintained in accordance with procedure. By November 16, operations focused on confirming the clearance of assigned areas. Patrols entered caves and tunnels where safe to do so, withdrawing when interior conditions posed excessive risk. Some openings were sealed with available materials. Others were marked for monitoring. On November 17, remaining resistance was sporadic. Small arms fire was reported from isolated points. Units responded with targeted fire and patrol actions. The overall level of activity continued to decline. By November 18, forward units reported extended periods without contact in several sectors. Patrols continued to test terrain and observe. Rear areas remained active with supply and maintenance tasks. On November 19, a small engagement occurred when a patrol encountered a concealed position firing from a narrow crevice. After a brief exchange, the position was engaged with grenades. No further fire was observed. Medical and logistical operations continued at a reduced tempo. Personnel remained in position, maintaining security and readiness. By November 20, organized resistance on Peleliu had diminished to isolated actions. Units continued patrols, observation, and security measures. Command posts maintained communication and reporting. Supply and evacuation systems remained in place. Daily activities consisted of patrols, maintenance of positions, resupply, and continued monitoring of known cave systems. Japanese defenders who remained continued to engage sporadically when opportunity arose. As November progressed, the operational focus shifted increasingly toward security and confirmation of cleared areas. Infantry units maintained readiness to respond to any renewed activity. Engineers continued to improve routes and seal openings where possible. Throughout this period, actions were conducted according to immediate tactical requirements. Units responded to observed enemy activity, terrain constraints, and logistical considerations as they occurred. The sequence of events reflected the continued execution of assigned tasks until resistance was reduced to isolated and sporadic actions across the island.